The smoke was already black by the time engine 14 turned onto Larkspur Lane, and I remember thinking, in the strange slow motion where your brain works during a disaster, that black smoke like that meant accelerant or old wiring, not just dry leaves. What I didn't expect, what I will never forget as long as I live, was the sight of a white Range Rover parked sideways across the private road, hazard lights blinking, with a woman in a quilted vest standing in front of my own fire engine with her arms crossed like she was blocking traffic at a school crossing. Behind her, my shed, the one where my late wife's gardening tools still hung on the wall exactly where she'd left them, was throwing sparks 20 feet into the night sky. Neighbors were filming on their phones. My daughter was screaming my name from the porch, and Ingrid Voss, president of the Thornbury Ridge Homeowners Association, was telling a fire captain that his truck was, and I quote, an unauthorized vehicle on a private road, and until I see documentation, it isn't going anywhere. What she didn't know yet was who was riding in the passenger seat of that truck, badge and all. What she really didn't know was how much rope she'd just handed me. Before I tell you how a burning garden shed turned into the biggest scandal Ashcombe County had seen in a decade, do me a favor. Drop in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, because these stories hit different when you know how many of us have lived through some version of this. All right, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Alexander Nowak, and for 11 years I've served as fire chief for the township of Ashcombe, a quiet forested community about 40 minutes outside the city. Before that, I spent 16 years as a firefighter and paramedic, working my way up through every rank the department had, learning things about fire behavior, dispatch protocols, and emergency access codes that most civilians never think about until the night they desperately need them. I moved into Thornbury Ridge Estates 6 years ago, after my wife Anna passed from ovarian cancer, because the house had a big backyard for my daughter Sophia, who was 9 at the time, and because the neighborhood was marketed as family first, safety conscious, community driven. I liked the sound of that. I liked quiet streets. After what my family had been through, quiet sounded like healing. I am, by nature, a rule follower. It's practically a professional requirement. Fire codes exist because people died before those codes were written. And I've spent my whole career respecting the invisible architecture of safety that most people never notice until it fails them. So when I moved into Thornbury Ridge, I paid my HOA dues on time. I trimmed my hedges to the regulation height. I painted my mailbox the approved shade of colonial slate, and I introduced myself to the board with a handshake instead of a complaint. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a place where my daughter could grow up safe, and where I could finally exhale after years of watching my wife disappear a little more every week. Anna and I had built that shed together the spring before her diagnosis, back when we still thought we had decades ahead of us instead of 11 months. I remember her standing in the driveway in her old flannel shirt, holding the level while I framed the door, laughing at me because I kept insisting the header had to be perfectly square, even though it was just a garden shed and not, in her words, a load-bearing wall in a hospital. That was who Anna was. She softened every edge I brought home from work, every ounce of procedure and precision I carried like armor after a bad shift. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to touch that shed for almost a year. When I finally did, I found her gardening gloves still hanging on a nail by the door, right where she'd left them, dirt still creased into the fingers. I never moved them. I told myself I'd get to it eventually. I never did. That detail matters later. Remember it. By the time Sophia turned 15, she'd grown into a quiet, watchful kid who'd inherited her mother's habit of noticing things, the way a neighbor's porch light flickered, the way a car idled a beat too long at the curb. She used to joke that living with a fire chief for a father meant she'd memorized every exit route in every building she'd ever entered, and she wasn't entirely wrong. We had a good rhythm, the two of us. Quiet dinners, Sunday maintenance around the yard. A life rebuilt slowly, plank by plank. Not unlike that shed. I tell you all this not because it's dramatic, but because it's the opposite of dramatic. It's the ordinary, hard-won peace that Ingrid Voss would eventually treat as something to be managed, regulated, and fined into submission. Ingrid Voss had been president of the Thornbury Ridge HOA for 9 years by the time I moved in, and within a month I understood why nobody ever ran against her. She wore the same quilted navy vest to every community event, rain or shine, summer or winter, with a laminated badge clipped to the collar that said, in gold cursive, Ingrid Voss, Community President, as if the HOA were a small European monarchy and she'd crowned herself its regent. She carried a clipboard everywhere, to the mailbox, to the community pool, even, according to one neighbour, to her own mother's funeral reception, where she reportedly used it to note down which attendees had parked on the grass. She had a habit of tapping her pen against that clipboard 3 times before delivering bad news, a small ritual that people in the neighbourhood had come to dread the way you'd dread a dentist's drill warming up. Her catchphrase, which she used so often that people did impressions of it at backyard barbecues when they thought she wasn't listening, was always the same 6 words. It's not personal, it's policy. She used it to justify fining a widow $150 for leaving her recycling bin out 4 hours past the posted pickup window. She used it to force a family with a disabled son to remove a wheelchair ramp because it violated uniform exterior guidelines. A decision the board quietly reversed only after a lawyer got involved and pointed out in writing that the ramp was federally protected under disability accommodation law. She used it on Henrik Larsson, a retired schoolteacher 2 doors down from me, when she had his prize rose trellis torn out because it was structurally unauthorized, even though he'd built it from the same catalogue the HOA's own newsletter had once recommended. She used it on a young couple who'd painted their front door a shade of red she deemed aesthetically incongruent, fining them weekly until they repainted it beige. Nobody crossed Ingrid because Ingrid didn't fight fair. She fought with fines, liens, and a small army of bylaws she'd personally rewritten over the years, one amendment at a time, until she'd quietly handed herself more unilateral power than any HOA president legally should have held. My first real run-in with her happened on a Tuesday evening in early spring. I had a contractor deliver a stack of lumber so I could build Sophia a treehouse. The delivery truck parked on the street in front of my driveway for just a few minutes while they unloaded. 4 minutes later, Ingrid was standing there, clipboard in hand. She informed me that unauthorized commercial vehicles required 72 hours of advance written notice to the HOA board. It's not personal, she said. It's policy. She tapped her pen against the clipboard 3 times. I stayed calm. I told her I understood the bylaw. A 10-minute delivery hardly seemed like something that deserved a violation. I even offered to submit the paperwork afterward if that would solve the problem. She looked at me like I was trying to negotiate with a parking meter. Rules don't retroactively apply themselves, Mr. Nowak, she said. I'll be issuing a citation. So I let it go. I paid the $25 fine. I convinced myself it wasn't worth starting a fight. What I didn't realize was that patience was exactly the wrong lesson to teach someone like Ingrid Voss. 2 weeks later, the real trouble began. I had left for a 24-hour shift at the fire station. Sophia, who was 15 at the time, was staying with a neighbour. Our elderly babysitter, Mrs. Papadopoulos from next door, was keeping an eye on the house. At 7 that morning, Ingrid showed up claiming my trash cans had been left at the curb 11 hours past the allowed pickup window. She taped a $75 fine to my front door, along with a laminated warning that read, "Third offence results in HOA legal review." The problem was, I hadn't even had a second offence. When I called to dispute it, she calmly explained that a previous, unrecorded verbal warning counted as offence number 1. That somehow made the treehouse lumber delivery offence number 2. I told her none of that made any sense. Her answer was something I never forgot. In fact, I wrote it down that very night. "I don't expect you to understand community governance, Chief Nowak. You're used to giving orders, not receiving them." That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about trash cans. It wasn't about bylaws. It wasn't about the rules. It was about a woman who couldn't stand the idea that someone else in her little kingdom carried a title too. The following week, everything crossed a line. Mrs. Papadopoulos, 81 years old, fell in her kitchen. Her son immediately called 911. The ambulance reached the entrance to Thornbury Ridge, only to discover the gate access code hadn't been updated. It was a problem the HOA had already known about for months. By pure coincidence, Ingrid was nearby walking her dog. Instead of opening the pedestrian gate, she refused. The paramedics explained it was a medical emergency. She insisted they wait for proper gate credentials. 11 extra minutes passed before they finally reached Mrs. Papadopoulos. Thankfully, she only suffered a bruised hip, but 11 minutes can mean the difference between life and death. If it had been a heart attack, the ending could have been very different. The moment I heard what happened, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. I simply asked them to review the community's emergency gate procedures. Ingrid's response came quickly. She sent the board a memo accusing me of using my position as fire chief to intimidate volunteer community leadership. Later, 2 board members quietly admitted they agreed with me, but neither of them was willing to say so publicly. They were afraid of becoming Ingrid's next target, afraid of the fines, afraid of the harassment. That was the day I started keeping a folder. Not a complaint folder, an evidence folder. That weekend, I learned something that changed everything. Henrik Larsson, a retired schoolteacher, asked if we could talk over coffee in his kitchen. He told me Ingrid had done something similar to him 3 years before I ever moved into Thornbury Ridge. His late wife had suffered a seizure. He called for an ambulance, but when the paramedics arrived at the neighborhood gate, Ingrid stopped them. She refused to let them through because Henrik's resident parking sticker had expired. Nearly 10 minutes were lost. Henrik never filed a complaint. He didn't think anyone would believe him over the woman carrying the clipboard and wearing the community president's badge. When I told him I believed every word, he broke down crying at his own kitchen table. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't one bad decision. It wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern. And in my line of work, patterns can be proven if you know where to find the paperwork. The following month, things crossed another line. A moving truck arrived at the Kowalczyk family's house, just 2 doors down from mine. The truck was delivering a specialized wheelchair-accessible bed for 8-year-old Milo. Milo had recently returned home after spending 6 weeks in a rehabilitation hospital. A terrible car accident had left him unable to walk without assistance. The delivery truck needed extra space to enter the street, but there was a problem. A large decorative stone planter blocked the entrance to Larkspur Lane. Ingrid had personally installed it. It had never been approved by the HOA board. It was there simply because she liked how it looked in front of her house. The driver politely asked if she could move one small potted shrub, just 6 inches, so the truck could pass. She refused. Her reason? Unauthorized landscaping disruption. Then she announced she needed to consult the bylaws. The truck waited. 1 hour, then another. 2 full hours. Later, Renata told me she had stood in her driveway, holding Milo in her arms. Both of them were crying, only 10 feet away. Ingrid stood there with her clipboard, calm, expressionless, repeating the same words. It's not personal. It's policy. By the time the delivery was finally allowed through, Milo had already spent another night sleeping in a chair. His old bed had already been removed. No one called the police. No one believed a delayed furniture delivery was something law enforcement would investigate. But I noticed something. Every single incident involved someone vulnerable. An elderly woman, a grieving widower, a disabled child, and every single time, Ingrid placed herself between that vulnerable person and the help they needed. Sometimes it was a locked gate. Sometimes it was paperwork. Sometimes it was bureaucracy. But the result was always the same. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't incompetence. It was a pattern. 9 years of learning that vulnerable people rarely fight back, so I started gathering everything, quietly, carefully, officially, using county channels. I requested records of every emergency dispatch sent to Thornbury Ridge Estates during the previous 5 years. I asked for gate access failures, road obstructions, response delays, anything that could affect emergency crews. As fire chief, I had every legal right to request those records for an emergency access review. I didn't even have to explain my personal reasons. A few days later, the records arrived, and what I found stunned me. 4 separate emergency calls had documented delays caused by blocked access or neighborhood obstructions. 2 of those reports specifically mentioned resident interference. Yet none of those incidents had ever been formally investigated. None of them listed Ingrid by name. Dispatch logs rarely identify civilians unless an officer files a supplemental report, and every responding crew had been too busy saving lives to stop and write one. Sometimes it was a locked gate. Sometimes it was paperwork. Sometimes it was bureaucracy. But the result was always the same. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't incompetence. It was a pattern. 9 years of learning that vulnerable people rarely fight back, so I started gathering everything, quietly, carefully, officially, using county channels. I requested records of every emergency dispatch sent to Thornbury Ridge Estates during the previous 5 years. I asked for gate access failures, road obstructions, response delays, anything that could affect emergency crews. As fire chief, I had every legal right to request those records for an emergency access review. I didn't even have to explain my personal reasons. A few days later, the records arrived, and what I found stunned me. 4 separate emergency calls had documented delays caused by blocked access or neighborhood obstructions. 2 of those reports specifically mentioned resident interference. Yet none of those incidents had ever been formally investigated. None of them listed Ingrid by name. Dispatch logs rarely identify civilians unless an officer files a supplemental report, and every responding crew had been too busy saving lives to stop and write one. I decided it was time to prepare, quietly, without telling anyone. I installed a home security camera. It covered my driveway and the shared section of Larkspur Lane. Officially, it was for package theft. But the truth was different. Something deep inside me, the instinct you develop after 16 years as a fire chief, kept telling me the same thing. You smell smoke, long before you ever see flames. And sooner or later, I was going to need evidence. Not long after that, neighbors started coming to me, one by one, quietly, almost like they were confessing a secret. Renata Kowalczyk told me Ingrid had once blocked the delivery of her son's wheelchair-accessible bed. 2 hours? Lost over missing paperwork. Dimitrios Papas, an elderly widower, admitted he had stopped asking the HOA for help altogether. Not because he didn't need it, because he was afraid. Afraid that speaking up would bring more fines, more harassment, more retaliation. Everyone had a story, but nobody wanted to be the first person willing to put their name on the record. Everyone hoped someone else would go first. Then, the fire happened. According to the fire marshal's investigation, it started with a faulty extension cord. I'd been using it to power a small space heater inside the backyard shed. An unusually cold stretch of weather had arrived. The heater was there to protect Anna's overwintering plants from freezing. That night, I was home, off duty. Sophia burst into my bedroom. She was screaming, "Dad, I smell smoke." I ran outside. The shed was already fully involved. Flames were pouring through the roof vents. Years of training took over. I didn't hesitate. I called the fire department immediately, reported the exact GPS location, provided access instructions. Then I started moving anything flammable away from the fence line while we waited. Engine 14 arrived in 6 minutes. An excellent response time. Everything should have been routine, but what happened next would soon become regional news. The sirens had woken Ingrid Voss. She walked outside wearing nothing but her robe and slippers. And somehow, she was already carrying that clipboard. To this day, I still have no idea how she managed to keep it within arm's reach at all times. She stepped directly in front of the fire engine, blocking the entrance to the private section of Larkspur Lane. Captain Reyes, a firefighter I'd worked beside for 9 years, asked her to move. Instead, she informed him that the engine was an unauthorized municipal vehicle. According to her, it needed HOA board approval before entering private community roads. She even quoted a bylaw, a rule that had absolutely no legal authority over emergency responders. Any rookie firefighter knew that. Captain Reyes stayed calm. He explained that an active structure fire overruled every HOA policy. She refused to move. Neighbors had already started recording everything. Phones were everywhere. On my front porch, Sophia stood crying, screaming for someone to just drive around her. 4 long minutes passed. 4 minutes. When your family's property is burning, 4 minutes feels like forever. Finally, Captain Reyes radioed dispatch. At the same time, I walked into the street wearing my full fire chief's uniform. I confirmed my identity, authorized the engine to proceed. Only then did Ingrid finally step aside. By then, the shed was beyond saving. It burned to the ground. Inside that shed, Anna's old gardening gloves still hung on a single nail. They burned too. The next morning, I watched the entire incident on my neighbor's doorbell camera. Every second, every delay, every decision. And as I watched those 4 minutes play back, something inside me changed. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I just became very quiet and very cold. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It was grief. I'd already lost my wife. Now I had almost lost another piece of her memory. Those 4 minutes kept replaying in my mind. If the fire had reached the house, if Sophia had still been inside, if the wind had changed direction, those lost minutes could have cost far more than a shed. The anger came the next morning. I pulled the dispatch records and compared them with everything I documented. Mrs. Papadopoulos, Henrik's late wife, Milo's delayed hospital bed, and now my own fire. 4 documented incidents. 1 person. The same pattern every time. Rules placed above human safety. That's when I stopped thinking like a grieving husband and started thinking like a fire chief. Most people think my job is just putting out fires. It isn't. It's documentation, investigations, accountability. I serve on the county's Emergency Access Review Board. When I report a pattern of emergency interference, it carries official weight. That's exactly what Ingrid had relied on for years. Every incident looked minor on its own, but together, they told a completely different story. My goal wasn't revenge, it was accountability. I wanted the people with legal authority to examine every incident side by side, so I built the case the same way I investigate a fire. Carefully, legally, with a complete paper trail. First, I requested 5 years of emergency dispatch records for Thornbury Ridge, including body camera footage, dashcam video, and reports involving delayed emergency access. Then I submitted the unedited footage of my own shed fire directly to the county. From that moment on, the evidence wasn't just mine anymore. It became part of an official public record. And once that happened, the investigation could no longer be ignored. Step 3 was simple. I reached out to Henrik, Renata, and Mrs. Papadopoulos' son. I asked if they would be willing to share their experiences officially if the case reached a hearing. No pressure, no forcing. I just wanted them to know one thing. They wouldn't be standing alone anymore. Step 4 was the most important. I requested the matter be added to the next Township Public Safety Commission hearing. It was a public meeting, open to residents, live streamed for anyone watching. Normally, those meetings attracted only a handful of people, but I knew that would change. Once people heard there was video of a fire engine being blocked, everyone would want to see it. I never warned Ingrid. I didn't have to. The county would notify every involved party through certified mail. She would find out the official way, with just enough time to worry, but not enough time to control the story. The night of the hearing, the community centre was packed. Cars filled the parking lot. People stood along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. For 9 years, people had stayed quiet, but now they wanted answers. I counted more than 60 people inside. Residents from Thornbury Ridge, neighbours from nearby communities. Even a local reporter from the Ashcombe Gazette arrived with a camera. And the moment Ingrid saw that camera, her confidence changed. Commissioner Elena Marchetti opened the meeting. The agenda item was clear: a formal review of emergency access issues inside Thornbury Ridge Estates. I looked across the room. Ingrid Voss sat in the second row. Navy vest, clipboard in her lap, her badge polished. She still looked like someone who believed she couldn't be challenged. Her husband Werner sat beside her, but unlike Ingrid, he didn't look so certain. When it was my turn, I stepped forward. I had testified at countless hearings before. My voice stayed calm. My hands were shaking slightly behind the podium. But nobody saw that. I presented the facts. 5 years of dispatch records. 4 documented incidents. Dates. Times. Consequences. I didn't need to exaggerate. The evidence spoke for itself. Then Commissioner Marchetti asked for the footage to be played. The room went completely silent. The kind of silence where everyone knows the truth is about to appear. The room went silent. My doorbell camera footage appeared on the projector. Timestamp visible. Engine 14's headlights moved across Larkspur Lane. Then everyone saw it. Ingrid Voss, standing directly in front of a fire engine, still wearing her robe, still holding that clipboard. Captain Reyes stood there trying to reason with her while flames burned behind him. The timer kept moving. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3, 4. When the timestamp crossed the 3-minute mark, people in the room reacted, because everyone understood one thing. During a structure fire, 3 unnecessary minutes can change everything. Then the hearing continued. Henrik Larsson spoke for the first time about the ambulance delay involving his wife. Renata described what happened with her son's medical bed delivery. Then the county dispatch supervisor confirmed something even more damaging. Thornbury Ridge had the highest number of resident interference reports among private communities in the county. I watched Ingrid throughout the hearing. The confidence disappeared. The tapping stopped. For the first time in 9 years. Ingrid Voss had no answer. Then her attorney stood up. He argued that HOA authority over private roads was a legal grey area. For a moment, I thought the case might get buried in technical arguments until Commissioner Marchetti asked one question. Are you saying an HOA rule can override state fire codes and emergency vehicle access laws? The attorney had no response, because he couldn't. The room erupted. The commission voted unanimously. The case was referred to the district attorney for possible obstruction charges, and Thornbury Ridge was ordered to rewrite its emergency access rules under county supervision. From that day forward, the HOA had no power to restrict emergency vehicles. The weeks after the hearing felt like watching a slow avalanche. The district attorney charged Ingrid with obstruction of emergency services. Her attorney negotiated a deal. She avoided jail time, but she was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. She was ordered to complete community service. and pay restitution toward emergency access improvements at Thornbury Ridge. The new board created a safety fund called the Rapid Response Improvement Initiative. Ingrid's name wasn't anywhere on it. She resigned as HOA president less than a week after the hearing. The official statement blamed personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. The Ashcombe Gazette published the story on its front page. The headline read, 9 minutes, how one HOA president's rulebook nearly cost a community its safety. Within days, the hearing footage spread across local communities. People who had never lived in Thornbury Ridge watched it, because everyone recognized the same thing. Every neighborhood has an Ingrid Voss. After everything ended, the biggest changes weren't in courtrooms or newspapers. They were in the neighborhood. Henrik Larsson told me one Sunday morning that, for the first time in 3 years, he slept through the night without reliving the memory of his wife's seizure, or the gate that refused to open. Renata Kowalczyk created a neighborhood emergency access group, something Ingrid never would have allowed. And Milo, after months of therapy, now walking again with a cane, insisted on delivering the group's first flyers himself. Mrs. Papadopoulos told me something I'll never forget. She had finally stopped keeping an emergency bag packed by her front door. For years, she kept it there because she was afraid help might not reach her in time. That small detail hurt more than almost anything else. The new HOA board moved quickly. They installed an automatic emergency override system on every gate. No waiting, no approvals, no clipboard, no person standing between first responders and someone who needed help. They also created new leadership rules. No HOA president could serve more than 3 consecutive terms. After 9 years under Ingrid, everyone agreed it was necessary. I only saw Ingrid once after that, at a hardware store. Ironically, we were both reaching for the same shelf of extension cords. Without the vest, without the badge, without the clipboard. She looked different, smaller. She didn't apologize. Not really. But she quietly said something I'll never forget. I didn't think it would matter. 4 minutes. I looked at her and told her the truth. 4 minutes is never nothing. 4 minutes can mean the difference between a minor injury and something worse. Between losing a shed and losing a home. Between replacing belongings and losing a person. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was explaining reality, the same way I would explain fire behavior to a new firefighter. She nodded, then walked away. I think about that moment often, because this experience taught me something important. The most dangerous threats in a community aren't always visible. Sometimes they're people who believe a title gives them control over other people's safety. People who hide behind rules, because nobody challenges them. Patience is valuable, but patience can become silence. And silence allows people like Ingrid Voss to build their own little kingdoms. What stopped her wasn't anger. It was evidence, documentation, and a community finally willing to stand together. None of us wanted to become heroes. Henrik just wanted peace. Renata just wanted her son's medical equipment delivered. Mrs. Papadopoulos just wanted to know help would arrive if she fell again. But when all those stories were finally placed together, everyone could see the truth. I never got Anna's gardening gloves back. But I gained something just as important. A neighborhood where the next person who calls 911 will never have to wonder whether someone with a clipboard will decide if their emergency is important enough. Sometimes, I still sit on my porch and look at the new shed Sophia and I built last summer, and I think about those 4 minutes. So I want to ask you, what would you have done, standing there, watching someone block the help your family needed? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And some of the stories you've shared are honestly harder to believe than fiction. If this story connected with you, subscribe for more stories about hidden battles, quiet justice, and the moments when ordinary people finally decide they've had enough. Until next time, remember this: the loudest person in the room isn't always the one with real authority. Stay safe.